Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in Python programming. The focus of today's lesson is working with APIs in Python programming. Now with that said, let's take a moment to explore the objectives for today's lesson. First, we'll define APIs in a bit of detail. Next, we'll move on to exploring the advantages and the use of APIs in Python programming. And as always, we'll wrap things up with a practical demonstration where we'll develop a very basic API. Let's kick things off by first defining what APIs are. An API, or an application programming interface, is a set of rules and protocols that allows different software applications to communicate and interact with each other. It defines how various components of software systems should interact, specifying the types of requests that can be made, the format of the data that should be exchanged, and lastly, the actions or responses that can be expected. Now, before we dive into the usage and some of the advantages of APIs, let's take a moment to have a look at a basic architecture. APIs usually work in the following way. We have a client. This could be a browser or a mobile device. The client then connects over the internet to an API engine. The API is what sits between the server and the client via the internet. So with an API, we can use HTTP requests to work with data. This usually requires methods such as get methods to get data, put methods to update data, post methods to add data, and delete methods to remove data from the source. In essence, an API allows us to exchange data between the source and the client. So why should one even consider using APIs in the first place? Well, APIs provide a way for different applications or services to leverage the functionalities of other software components without needing to understand the complexities of its implementation. They act as intermediaries, enabling seamless communication and data exchange between different systems, platforms, or programming languages. They also serve as building blocks for developers, allowing them to integrate existing services, access data, and extend the capabilities of their own applications. Generally speaking, there are two different types of APIs: web APIs as well as library or framework APIs. Web APIs are specifically designed for web-based applications. They allow developers to interact with web services or retrieve data from remote servers using standard protocols such as HTTP. Web APIs often return data in formats like JSON or XML, which can be easily consumed by client applications. Library or framework APIs, on the other hand, usually consist of software development kits and are used to access the functionalities and features of those software components. Library APIs are usually used within the same programming language and are called directly, while framework APIs provide a structured way of building applications by following a specific framework guideline. Some of the advantages of APIs include the following: modularity and code reusability, integration and interoperability, access to third-party services, as well as faster development and reduced costs. Wonderful. Now with that said, let's dive into our practical demonstration and let's get started with developing our very own basic API. Now, in order to get started with today's practical demonstration, we are going to be using FastAPI, which is a web framework for building APIs and RESTful services. So if you do a simple search on FastAPI, the first result is basically what you're looking for. And here you'll find all the documentation on FastAPI. The first thing we need to do is install FastAPI. And so if we scroll down in the documentation, you'll see that for Python, we can simply do another pip install FastAPI. You could also install the UVcorn server. However, just by doing a pip install FastAPI, you usually get the UVcorn server installed as well. So in my command line, what I'll do is I'll first bring up my command line and I'll say pip install FastAPI. Once again, I already have this installed, so you'll notice that the requirement has already been satisfied. Great. So now that FastAPI has been installed, we can move on to our IDE. Now, inside of my PyCharm IDE, I'm going to start by calling the framework. So I'll say from FastAPI import FastAPI, like this. Next, I'm going to start scripting. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable called app over here. I'll set this equal to FastAPI, which we just imported, so that we can work with this object to start building our API. Now this is where we can start building our API. So I'll create a decorator called app.get, and this is going to be a get method. This is a get request. This is for me to get data from my API. And then what I need to do is supply it with a path over here. As a string, I'll just add a slash. And then on a new line, I'll create an async method or function, and I'll call this root. This is going to be the entry point of our API application. So on a new line, I simply want to return some sort of data. And the data I'm going to return here is a dictionary, or what is known as a JSON object. Now, the really beautiful thing about Fast API is that it's intelligent and intuitive enough to understand that a JSON object and a dictionary is exactly the same thing. So I'll simply just paste that over here, and let's quickly review this dictionary. So these are key pair values, as we already know from previous lessons. So for if name, we have a value of John. For the key L name, we have a value of Doe. For age, we have a value of 25. Job title, we have a value of engineer. And employee ID, we have a value of 5. Now, this is what I'm going to return in my application or my API. And just with these 3 lines, we managed to build a very, very basic API that captures the data of an employee. Now, how exactly do we run this? So what you want to do is head over to your terminal in PyCharm over here. Now, don't stress too much about this error over here. This error just basically refers to the fact that the user running the script is undefined. This won't affect the output of your program. So I need to run uvcorn main :app and -- reload. And what this is going to do is open up a server instance for my API. And whenever I make changes, this will continue to reload. So if I hit enter over here, you'll notice that my server has started. And you can actually copy and paste this URL, or you could simply just click this, and this will now redirect me to my API. And notice now I have a very basic API where I can get data such as the first name, last name, age, job title, and employee ID of the specific employee. And that's it. That's how easy it is to create an API using Fast API. Now let's take this one step further. Remember, in our discussion, we mentioned that we can build applications so that our 2 systems or various systems can communicate. I'm going to create a new file over here, and I'm simply going to call this file get_data.py. Remember, this is a brand new script over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow this script to communicate with the API that we've built in this main script over here. To do this, I'm simply going to import my requests library. Usually this is installed by default with Python. If not, you can simply do a pip install. And then I'm going to create a variable called get_requests. And I'm going to set this equal to requests.get. So this is a get request. And all I need to do is pass in a URL over here. I'll head over to my script over here, and I'll grab the URL that we have over here. I'll copy this, and I'll paste this into my parameter. This also needs to be a string. So let's remove this and then create a string, clear up all spaces. And now the idea is to get whatever data is being posted to this URL. Also note that this is being run locally on our machine and not over the internet. And then I'll simply do a print over here, and I'll print the get requests, and I'll call the .json function here so that we know we are interpreting a JSON file. Great. So let's also just increase the size of our text. And now if I run this, we don't have an output, and that is because I need to change my script that's running. So if I click on this main over here and I select current file, that's going to run this current file, the get data file. And if I run this now, notice that I'm getting the data from my API. Excellent. Now, before we wrap things up, let's do one more example. I'm going to head back over to this main file over here. I'm going to select current files that we run this main file. And I'm going to try to generate dynamic values for my data, specifically the employee ID over here. So I'm going to do this using the random module. So in my script over here, I'm going to import random, And what I'll do next is I'll take this object over here and I'll remove this and I'll create a variable to hold this object called data. And the exact same is going to apply. The only difference here is we've assigned that object to a variable so that we can use it over here. I'll then just return data. This will ensure the same result for this specific API call, this endpoint over here. But now I'm going to create a new endpoint. So I'll call app or @app, the decorator, .get once again. And from my root folder, I'm going to have a new endpoint called random over here. And I'm going to do the exact same thing where I create an async function. And I'm going to call this rand underscore emp for employee ID. And this takes in no parameters. I'll close this off, and on a new line over here, I need to start scripting out my function body. So I'll say rand, which is going to be of int, equals random dot integer, and we want to generate a random number between 0 and 50. So the lower limit and the upper limit, which is exclusive. And then on a new line, I'm going to call this data object that I created here, and I want to randomly generate an employee ID. So I need this key over here. So I'm going to say emp ID, and I'm going to set this equal to rand, and then I'll simply just return data. Great. So let's just take a look at what's happening over here. We created a new endpoint from our root endpoint. So that means if we now visit our localhost appended with this random endpoint over here, we're going to randomly generate an employee ID between 0 and 50. And that is because we have access to the key. So we take that data object, grab the emp ID, and then assign a random value. Now let's see this in action. So I'll run the script. And then inside of my terminal, we also want to make sure that the server is up and running, and this looks good. In the event that it's not up and running, we can simply just run that uvicorn main app reload statement in our terminal over here. So if I head back over to the browser and I refresh, this will be exactly the same because this is the first endpoint that we built. Let's maybe just increase this slightly so we can see this on the screen. And now what I'll do is at the end over here, I'm simply just going to tack on the random endpoint, and notice that my employee ID has changed from 5 to 10. And if I refresh over and over, you'll notice that I receive different values over here. And that is because we've assigned a random function or feature to our employee ID. We can also test this in our get data script over here by tacking on random. We also want to make sure that we are going to run the current file. And if I run this now, notice that even inside of my new program, I receive random values for my employee ID. And that is it for today's lesson. In today's lesson, we learned all about how APIs work. We learned the usage as well as the benefits or advantages of using APIs in our programs. We also learned how to develop a very, very basic API using Fast API. In our next lesson, we're going to work with the put, post, and delete methods for our API endpoints. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.